Man. Today we getting into a great video, slavery and religion, how one pushes the other. A lot of times we just think about slavery. A lot of times we don't think of things like religion, but a lot of times what we believe in is the same jail cell or the thing that has us enslaved, right? Because one thing that they say in history, right, the greatest weapon that the oppressor has is the mind of the oppressed. And that is a quote from Steve Biko. That is a quote from Steve Biko, South African Steve Biko. All right. The greatest weapon that the oppressor has is the mind of the oppressed. So let's get into this video. Let's check it out.
Okay, so slavery and religion. We didn't set ourselves, with a very narrow or easily focused thing between these. These are two topics, I would say, of vast scope, both globally and also throughout time in human history. And so we're going to have to narrow it in order to actually talk about this a little bit. I mean, the two of them together also have a considerable amount of overlap. And if we were to look at, for example, the one, we've always said before, we have a bunch of examples where when you take religion, there is a dividing line between formal, organized religion and then some of these informal, customary, just spiritual, ritual activities that I guess aren't necessarily formal or organized religion, but maybe are in that same sphere. And so we've talked before about this. It's easy to take that formal religion and stick churches in there, or mosques, or temples, or synagogues, or gurdwaras. You can stick those all inside that pretty easily and draw the little dotted line about it. But then there's all these other things that people do, like crossing your fingers, knocking on wood, celebrating Christmas. I mean, it's got the word Christ in it. It doesn't mean that it's religious in a certain sense, but anyway, there's some things about it. Doing yoga. Yoga, it comes out of religious tradition, even if a lot of practitioners of it in the West don't consider themselves what they're doing to be religious. Shaheen?
Yeah. Yoga actually means to yoke yourself to a deity.
To yoke, so there you go. So you're doing yoga. Well, and Christmas means, participating in a wedding ceremony, right? Ceremonial. All of these symbolic things that you do. Your dad leads the daughter down an aisle, holding, giving, her to the guy. There's a white dress. There's all these other kinds of things, flowers, in the Western tradition. Doing charity work. Going to a Raptors game. I mean, we've seen that in past when we've looked at the history of this, all sporting events, all athletic competition were originally religious festivals, right? And lots of what happens still, it's almost, there's like very similar stuff that's happening at a Raptors game, as what's happening in ancient Rome at a chariot race where, the cities, you have the different teams, the Reds and the Blues or something like that, and the cities, absolutely is broken into factions about whether you're on the one side of the one or not. And I don't know, you're doing everything still like the wave. You're still interested when the ball's going. You still do this sympathetic magic where everybody goes, oh, because they want to make it. If you do this, then that'll make the ball go in, right? There's all these things where you have to. You've worn the one jersey, and that's when they won. So now you've been wearing that this entire year, so that they keep winning, and it worked. Okay.
Without washing the jersey.
Without washing the jersey, don't wash it. Yeah, you have to do all of those kind of ritualistic activities. So what I want to kind of just say here is then religion is a bigger, foggier category or whatever than just a little thing that we sometimes like to draw inside this dotted line and put in a pen, right? Whoopsie, I'm going the wrong way now. Okay, this way. So the same thing is going to be probably true with slavery, as a topic. So on the one hand, when we had the picture advertising this, we're thinking of this formal definition of when it was legal. Chattel slavery is the technical definition. We'll talk about that, or the technical term for it, not definition. And sometimes drawing the line between that and other oppressive practices that might be akin to slavery. Sometimes people, some of these that are ongoing today, are called maybe neo-slavery or modern or 21st century slavery. So we know the one, and when we think of it in our head, historic or traditional or chattel slavery, but there's also, of course, human trafficking. There's debt bondage, forced labor that's ongoing that people experience. There's child labor, including things like child soldiers or forced or underage marriages. And maybe prison labor, right? So now that's also a thing. There's an amazing percentage, totally historically unprecedented percentage of the population of the United States is now incarcerated. And ever more of the people that are in these prisons, are actually now in prison labor where they're essentially uncompensated for it. So, although this is not the topic of tonight's lecture, we want to touch on this kind of neo-slavery or modern things that are akin to slavery. The Global Slavery Index indicates anyway that 40 million individuals are currently trapped in some form of modern slavery. According to them, the graphics that they put out, these is areas in the globe where there's the most prevalence of these kinds of modern slavery. Of these, 71% of the individuals trapped in modern slavery are female, 29% are male. There's some 100,000 or more child soldiers right now in the world. 15.4 million, especially girls, are in forced marriages. And then there's some 24.9 million people in forced labor of some type or other. For example, debt bondage is apparently very prevalent in South Asia, for example, where you have to pay off even inherited debt that you can never get out of. So beyond those, though, I want to go to that inner cordon pen just so that we can kind of narrow what we're talking about in this particular presentation. So we're going to look at some particular organized religions in this case. This is a very vast topic, so we'll look at the West. We're going to look at paganism, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And we're going to look specifically at this kind of, not the current 21st century slavery, but especially ancient slavery, medieval serfdom that evolves out of ancient slavery, medieval slavery, and then modern slavery, all of which are connected to each other. And by modern, I use the term modern, anything that's after 1492. And so that means, because I'm a medievalist, right? So anyway, okay. So traditional slavery. So illegal today in all the world's countries that are recognized. There are places where that aren't recognized as countries, where it may not be the case. Traditional slavery, however, was legal in most societies until the 19th century. It's also called chattel slavery because the people are considered to be chattel, which is word for personal property of a legal owner. So in this kind of slavery, chattel slavery, enslaved people are legally redefined as property that can be bought and sold, and indeed the part of the whole idea of the system is dehumanizing the other, so that whereas in modern times now we are very cognizant in saying things like enslaved people, enslaved persons, but the argument of people within the system, and indeed their blind spot often of their paradigm and worldview, is that the people who are enslaved aren't people at all, and they do everything in their power to make themselves think that, right? Okay, so this kind of slavery, this traditional slavery, it's illegal in all the world's countries, as we say. So in what year did the last country to criminalize slavery do so? 1861, Elizabeth guesses. Anybody else? Shaheen?
Early to mid 20th century.
Early to mid 20th century. Any other guesses? The 1970s? 2007. Thank you, Mauritania. If you can imagine. Actually, 2010, Western Sahara, but it's not a recognized country. So Western Sahara would be more recently even than this. But anyway, of the generally recognized countries, Mauritania, 2007, if you can imagine. No, well, so criminalized for the people that are holding slaves. Those are the criminals in this case. So the slaves are not, people who've been enslaved are not criminals. It's people who are enslaving other people who are, are engaged in criminal activity globally now in every recognized country, right?
I was thinking of Brazil.
Yeah. So Elizabeth was thinking of Brazil. So yeah, there is in fact, what you're saying, 1888 here is where Brazil then is.
John, remember to use the clicker for the people watching online.
Thank you. I forgot I have my clicker. Okay. So here's a map. So we're thinking of Brazil. So in the late 1880s here, 1888, that's the end of slavery, the abolition of slavery in Brazil. We had over here Mauritania. This is the abolition of slavery in 1981. It's the criminalization of slavery is the 2007 thing in Mauritania, and Western Sahara, I pointed out here, is in 2010 is when they've criminalized slavery. So the earliest, in this case, in terms of abolishing slavery, is in some of the northern European countries, and then East Asia. As it's sort of spreading slowly into the modern era, abolition. But it's really quite recently that all of this has occurred. And I was starting to even think, if we think about it even, here where we're at, 1865 is not that long ago. Sheen?
Quick question. I'm looking at the map for the Nordic countries, and I'm just wondering that it says like the medieval ages for them, but didn't they still continue to have slaves in their colonies?
So the Vikings had slaves, but this is after the Vikings are gone, right? So this is, they get Christianized, and they what they've done here is abolish slaves. It doesn't mean that you can't bring a slave to the country. And so in some of these, so this is the abolition of slavery. It's not the criminalization. What we had done in that previous thing, I didn't have a map for criminalization, so I wasn't able to find that. So that thing with the 2007, that's criminalization. We'll just have a couple examples of this. So in terms of abolition, this is an example of how this happened. So Louis X, the King of France, in the the early 14th century, he abolished slavery in France using the etymology of the word franc, which actually means free. He says France signifies freedom, and he also decreed that any slave setting foot in the kingdom would be freed. And so that's an early example of abolition. But there's also economics behind this. And so one of the things that had happened through the course of the Middle Ages is that, so whereas in the late Roman Empire, there were large populations of what were called slave, we use the word slave in modern English. Latin, that is servi, so servant, servus, service. And so the servi acquire more and more rights, and they become less slaves and they become more serfs. And so there ends up being in the West, in the Christian West, this population of what we think of peasants, serfs, who don't have all of the same, they aren't subject to all the same things that a slave would be, but they are still not free because they are attached to property. So the difference between what we'll talk about chattel slavery, where people can be bought and sold, and serfdom is you're part of the real estate. And so the property can be bought and sold, and you're kind of like the house that's built on it, because again, you're tied to the land and all your descendants and everything like that. So you owe certain obligations to the landowner. You're supposed to farm it on certain days. You maybe have rights to a certain portion of the harvest yourself and this kind of a thing. And so this is essentially what serfdom happened. And so by this point, essentially, the French king is able to say slavery, which is this has evolved into is a slightly different practice than what they have in terms of serfdom. We're abolishing. We're not going to allow that in France. They're also fairly early on in getting rid of serfdom. And the reason for it, though, economically, as opposed to morally or religiously, is that when you have huge population boom, and so the population of France in the 14th century, this is right before the Black Death, right? So it had grown to 17 million. And so then when the Black Death hit in the middle of the century, and a third or half of the people ultimately, over the course of multiple recurrences of the plague, died. That's like two-thirds survived ultimately. The population shrinks. Then France's population didn't recover to what it had been here in the central Middle Ages until like the 1700s or something like that. And so as a result of that, what ends up happening is you only have so much land, and if you start having all of these people, you can imagine that depresses wages, right? And so the land becomes much more valuable than the people, and so if you have to do this thing where you have to raise a slave from baby and pay for all of that cost, that isn't helping you one bit as a landowner. And so actually at a certain point throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern times, noble landowners in Europe actually wanted to get rid of all of their serfs where humanly possible, and by hook or by crook, however they could expel them from the land so that they could instead rent it out and things like that and get cash instead of just having agricultural produce from their tenants.
David Foote says that demography can explain 3/4 of everything.
Yeah.
He's a demographer, of course.
Yeah. Well, and whereas I'm not going to always say that economics are the only motivator. There's often a very powerful motivator, and sometimes we can look at what the economic and demographic background to a story particularly is. And so this is certainly kind of part of the timing here of Northern and Western European early moves into this idea of abolition. They're abolishing slavery so that they could get you to pay rent, because otherwise you get to live there for free as a serf, right? Okay, so despite then the fact that the word France signifies freedom, so France does mean that. Nevertheless, when France established itself as an overseas empire, so in the imperial age and the modern era, France, like the other European powers, built that colonial empire on the backs of slave labor. And so colonial empires, if we just look at that same demographic or economic equation, have exactly the opposite issue in the labor equation and labor/land equation, right? So when you go around with guns and cannons and boats and you just steal vast tracts of land from indigenous peoples all around the entire planet, you have all the free land in the world, but you don't have any people to do the labor. And so getting any French people to move to Canada was almost impossible, which is why, this is why the population of Canada was so small by the time of the French and Indian War, right? And so likewise, trying to get French people to move to the West Indies, which was a much more valuable French colony, Haiti, for what's now Haiti, was actually quite difficult. They couldn't get the French people to go move there because you'd die of malaria and things like that. And so the landowners then imported then slave labor because they didn't have any. That was how they were able to exploit all of this free land that they had, right? So it's the complete opposite economic issue. Okay, so that's why I just bring this map back here again, so we can kind of see how this works economically. So in places that develop large populations early, you can see that's where there's early abolition. China had a very early period of abolition too. It's just that it didn't take entirely, and so this is why this is a later abolition. But it also had a very early one. So some of those, some of that happens, whereas in places that are less developed economically and poorer, that's when these come later. Okay, so we had the year when slavery was finally criminalized everywhere. What year did slavery begin? Those are Sumerians. You can see the Sumerians there having slaves. Did they start it? Well, everything starts in Sumeria in terms of history, but in fact, we have to say a big old question mark in terms of history, because slavery is a prehistoric institution. Slavery is well established in all historic ancient civilizations when they first become historic. So in other words, as soon as there begin to be written records anywhere, they already just kind of casually mention slavery as something that they just assume as a natural part of existence that they've had from time immemorial. They have no memory of it starting or any such thing. That's something that always was. So it's an inherited institution for historic civilizations. As we've looked at it through anthropology and other kinds of things, archaeology, looking at hunter-gatherer remains and things like that, although slavery does in some rare circumstances exist in hunter-gatherer societies, it generally isn't very pronounced or widespread in these, because you need to have, in order for slavery to be economically viable, you need to have both economic surplus. So hunter-gatherers are pretty much hunting and gathering mostly for themselves and having a pretty good time at it usually, comparatively. Whereas once you start in on agriculture, then you can, to get a lot more immediate, get a lot more surplus, and also you can concentrate population. And so where there's a big concentration of population, where there's surpluses, then they can have slavery. So with the invention and spread of agriculture in the Neolithic era, so this is again prehistoric times in the 7000s before the Common Era, slavery was already then widespread and therefore established when those societies become literate and start to give us records for the first time. And so I have here, for example, the Code of Hammurabi, so the ancient Babylonian law code from 1754 BCE. So it just includes, quite casually, mentions about slaves and slavery and things like that. There's not anything about, we just thought this thing up, some of these people are going to be slaves now, isn't this a great idea, or anything like that. Rather, it's something that they have, right? And they're just simply talking about it. And so and this is one of the very earliest complete texts we have of anything, certainly of things like a law code. Okay, so where do people get slaves? So all across the ancient world, but as we have recorded, for example, in the ancient Greeks, Homer, other pre-classical authors from the oral tradition in ancient Greece, they saw slavery as an inevitable consequence of war. So we have that phrase, to the victors go the spoils. So in this particular case, often when you're talking about a victor, you're not just plundering the people's property or taking over their land and their city, and now it's your land and city. You are often also taking the person. Shaheen.
That looks like the rape of Cassandra.
Is it Cassandra? It
like
could
her.
be. Yeah, it does look like it.
It looks like she's holding onto a statue of Athena.
Yeah, you're right. So yeah, it's Ajax the Lesser, and like you said, I think it's Cassandra. And so essentially, though, this is from Homer, right? Is the idea. So from the Iliad, this is a mythological scene, of this idea, though, that these ancient Greek heroes could take as booty captured Trojan women, who then are very clearly, they're not only slaves, but obviously sexual slaves. So that's one of the main components of slavery, going all the way back to when history begins, right? And so,
There is evidence to suggest that chimpanzees do this as well.
Oh,
so chimpanzees are known to wage war. They will go into neighboring territories where other chimp groups are, and they will kill them. They will kill the males, and they will take the females.
Okay. Yeah. So when we say, before, we're talking about an inherited institution. So there's a whole bunch of things that people do, that despite the fact that we in the modern and now postmodern era have inherited ideas like social contract theory from modern philosophers, which more or less come up with this idea that individual cavemen are inventing things by, sitting around, doing a brainstorming session. Well, let's invent slavery now. Actually, most of these things are things that they're doing before they have the capacity to think or talk about anything, right? And so these are, inherited from time immemorial. And so including this practice, right? But this practice is totally ingrained as far as the ancient Greeks are concerned in their heroic past, as it's described in Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this was continued to be contemporary practice for the ancient Greeks when they enter the historic times. And so one of the things that could happen is they had all these different city-states, and one of the things that could happen is that your city-state could go to war with another city-state, and if it wins, potentially enslave the entire population. And so a very famous example of that is essentially in the prehistory, Sparta going to war, with its neighboring city and reducing them all to the status of being helots, which is not the same ultimately. I didn't put this in a slide because it's actually a little complicated. So a helot, although is a kind of slave, it's actually also kind of a serf. And so as opposed to being a chattel slavery where helots can't be sold, they're part of the land that the Spartans control through their kind of unique system. But essentially it would also be possible the citizens of Thebes, which is another one of the Greek city-states, also got conquered at one point, and then they all got subjected to be slavery, subjected to become enslaved, although they were liberated, and that was considered to be a big boon by the person who liberated them. So anyway, so that whole thing, you could lose the whole city, the whole game. Otherwise, it would happen is that you simply would go to war. So Athens had this disastrous expedition to Sicily. It's one of the major failures of the Athenian democracy. When they lost, the Sicilians took all of the Athenian troops that they captured or surrendered and sold them all into slavery. And so that's just how slavery would happen. So as the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus says when he's talking about it, war is the father of all, the king of all. He turns some people into slaves and he sets others free, right? So some people through revolt or revolution get away in terms of war from slavery, but a lot of others get enslaved in antiquity. So what are the kind of conditions of slavery in antiquity? Throughout everywhere in the ancient world, just as everybody was mostly engaged in agriculture. We are so removed from it now in our own world and time, we don't think about it, but a huge proportion of the entire population was engaged in agriculture, and indeed that's where most of the slaves would be too. But beyond doing agricultural work, which was the kind of work that everybody was doing, slaves were also singled out for particularly horrific professions that included things like being down in the mines, which you don't have a very long lifespan, generally speaking, if you're a mine worker, and also being subject to brothels, especially really bad brothels. So anyway, so those would tend to often be quite brutal conditions. By contrast with though there was also, at the other end of the spectrum of still the condition of being a chattel slave, there would be slaves that had highly skilled trades. So there'd be everything from craftsmen to even bankers, to like domestic servants. They might live in actually relatively better conditions than, let's say, the poorest landless peasants. So one of the things that happens in societies when there's massive power and wealth inequality, the people that are controlling the wealth, having access to them means that you also have access to like a lot more power, let's say, than if you're just in the big masses of people that don't have any power, right? And so if you, let's say, are the king's chief eunuch, you're an unfree person, you're a slave, you've been made a eunuch. In a lot of ways, this is a bad lot in life. Nevertheless, you're talking to the king every day. This is you watch like Game of Thrones. It's like Lord Varys, right? And so Lord Varys he ultimately did get killed. A spoiler. I'm sorry if you haven't seen that. But anyway, there's but you are able to suggest a lot of things whispering into the king's ear. You may well be able to control so much more than you otherwise would. This is going to be true for house servants of nobles, at a lower scale and that kind of a thing. And indeed, if you have a slave that has this particular skill or craft, that could be very valuable and make all kinds of income for whoever owns you. And so therefore be better treated than a mind slave for sure. Okay, so one of the ironies is that on the one hand, while classical Athens was this innovator who is looked back upon as essentially one of these beginnings of democracy, it was also very much a slave society, and indeed there were more slaves in ancient Athens than any other ancient Greek city-state. And so maybe 80,000 slaves they had maybe, so about 30% of the population. And apparently the majority of free Athenians at least owned one slave. And if you didn't own a slave, that was a real sign that you were a real poor Athenian, and so people pitied you a lot. There's a guy named Lysias who has a discourse in which he has a poor Athenian who's become an invalid and who essentially is writing his complaint. And one of the characteristics, this isn't a real Athenian, but just as to kind of just explain local expectations and social customs, the person complains, "My income is very small now, and I'm required to do these things myself, and I do not even have the means to purchase a slave who could do these things for me." So this poor person, has to do all this, combing their hair and stuff like that they would normally, be able to have a slave do, right? Or, for example, in this case, you've gotten drunk, and you have to, you want to vomit, and the slave holds your hair for you and helps you get the bucket and that kind of a thing and picks up the vomit. So there's a depiction of that, right? So anyway, if you're a poor Athenian, you don't have that. So it's so ubiquitous that then the philosophers began to conclude that it had to be part of the natural order of the universe. So in the politics, there are several developments up to this date, but Aristotle tends to put the big golden stamp on it here with writing in the Politics. He that can foresee with his mind is naturally ruler and naturally master, and he that can do these things with his body is subject and naturally a slave. And so he essentially creates a theory of natural slavery where essentially the thinker is like the philosopher kings. These guys obviously should be the natural masters, and if you're just essentially a physical laborer, you have a natural condition of being a slave as far as Aristotle is concerned. And as he goes on, he argues that if you are then someone who is naturally a slave, you might be able to comprehend reason. So someone can tell you something you may be able to understand, unlike a dumb animal. Nevertheless, he says that natural slave has not got the deliberative part at all. So you can't be thinking of the ideas. You can maybe only be receptive of them. And so this is again part of the whole Greek idea and Roman too, ancient idea especially of active and passive. And we'll talk about this in 2 weeks when we talk about Greek ideas and Roman ideas about homosexuality, but it also ultimately ends up figuring into a whole bunch of things. That's the undergirding for patriarchy. So one of the issues is that throughout all of this, and as I'm doing this entire lecture, as I was doing it, all the reading for it, one of the other bits of overlap that we aren't getting to is the condition of women and the status of women often is also sort of intimately connected with this power structure. Women are, as we see right now in terms of modern times, of all of the 40 million people enslaved, they were 70-some%. And likewise, even women constitute a large percentage of the slave population in antiquity. And women who weren't slaves, nevertheless, were subject to lots of the same sorts of controls that slaves are in highly hierarchical societies that are undergirded by these kind of ideas, right? Okay. So that's the background of slavery. Let's talk about slavery and religion. So looking at slavery in the Hebrew Bible. So one of the main things that we maybe think about in terms of the Hebrew Bible is we think of the fact that in the origin story in Exodus of the Israelites are essentially coming out of Egypt having been enslaved, and so in some sense there is this story of emancipation from slavery, so that slavery had been this bad condition for us, and now we have been freed and we are our own people because of God's direct intervention. Nevertheless, although that is a central narrative of Exodus, the Hebrew Bible does not actually condemn or forbid slavery in more general terms. So there are some prohibitions about enslaving fellow Israelites in Levitical law, in Torah, and there are rules for freeing enslaved Israelite men anyway. Especially, the biblical law treats slavery in ways that are actually very, very similar to other ancient law codes. So things like the Code of Hammurabi that we saw before would have been an earlier example, and this is a more recent example of those kind of law codes. So let's look at it a little bit. So from the book of Leviticus and Torah here, the Pentateuch, the Holiness Code, it here is specifically condoning or legalizing slave trade. So we read, "As for the male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves." So Gentiles, you can go ahead and acquire through war or however you're going to do it, a purchase. You can get male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from the aliens residing with you. So there are Canaanites and Midianites and things like that live in the land with you. You can make them your slaves. And from their families that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, so you can send them an inheritance, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness. Okay, so in another portion of the law here in Exodus, the covenant code is called. So you are to free your male Israelite slaves eventually, although there's a loophole that you can get out of it. But you can also then keep any children born into slavery permanently under certain circumstances. So let's read this one. So these are the ordinances that you shall set before them. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, so if you buy an Israelite who's already a slave, who's a male, he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go out a free person without debt. So essentially, you're not supposed to keep Israelite slave males as slaves but you get to keep them for 6 years, right? So if he comes in single, so if he's unmarried, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, when he comes in, so he came in single and you gave him a wife, if you're the master, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. So those kids are slaves, as property inherited according to Levitical law or Exodus law, covenant code. Okay, goes on to say, here's the way in which want to sell your Israelite daughter into slavery. So when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do, but if she does not please her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt unfairly with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. You can see what this kind of slavery is being used for, right? So this is concubinage, right? So sexual slavery. So if the man who buys her is using her as his own concubine, this is what happens. But if he designates her as a son, that's a different circumstance. So So if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. And if he does not do these things for her, she shall go out without debt, without payment of money. Right? So we can see there's a bunch of different ways for which, this was this thing I was thinking about in terms of this crossover between slavery and just being a woman in antiquity and the Middle Ages. The custom of marriage, although we have this idea of marriage as being founded on love and all these kind of things, in so many cases it's actually founded on property rights and patriarchy controlling bloodlines, and all through the Middle Ages. So the Burgundian law, for example, specifies that when you're buying a wife, you give the money to the dad, and the payment number one on the wedding day, and then on the next morning, then you pay the residue, the rest that you owe, because the Burgundian law here is specifying as you're buying a wife that she has to be a virgin, and so that's when the payment you tell on the next day, right? And so that's all the way through the Middle Ages, anyway. So that's marriage. Okay. This though, even though this is maybe appalling to read this out of the Bible, this is actually quite though similar to all of the ancient neighbors. So the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, this stuff we're reading right here, is written during the first temple period of ancient Judaism, so the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. It's the Iron Age kingdom of Judah prior to the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of Solomon's temple. So Judah, at this time, Iron Age Judah, like all of its contemporary neighbors, practiced slavery, and as appalling as these verses seem today, the biblical law treats the institution in ways that are very similar to all contemporary ancient legal codes. So it's not especially bad. It's bad, but same bad. Okay, so fast forwarding a little bit, what does Jesus have to say? So Jesus is a Jew of the Second Temple period, so some 500, 600 years later. Now, at this point, Judea is a province in the Roman Empire, or a client kingdom in certain parts of his life. Jesus announced in what he was talking about a heavenly kingdom where the last would be first and the first would be last, teaching things like, whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man, which is to say he himself, Jesus, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that's at least words attributed to Jesus that are found in the canonical Gospel of Matthew. So the idea, anyway, of the kingdom in this particular idea is that everybody's to be slaves, or that the slaves, anyway, are to come first in the kingdom of heaven, right? So Jesus also tells numerous parables about slaves. For example, this painting from the Renaissance is a depiction of Jesus. A Roman centurion has come to Jesus and asked to have his slave boy be healed. And so the healing occurs at a distance. Jesus doesn't actually go to the household or anything like that. But the interesting thing that happens here is that the Roman custom here of a centurion or whatever having a slave boy, is really, also a indication of a sexual relationship that Jesus doesn't do anything like in saying, you must now free that boy, or you shouldn't be doing this like that. Just free it's just part of the background information here as the slave boy is freed. So Jesus uses this a relationship that exists ubiquitously in the background of Roman society, of master and slaves, as an analogy for the relationship between God and humans. And so Christians then are envisioning themselves as slaves in these analogies, slaves to God, in this heavenly kingdom, a just kingdom, as opposed to the Roman kingdom, Roman Empire. Jesus himself promoted things like debt forgiveness. So there is for example, the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us. And so in an agricultural peasant society like Jesus comes from, Galilee, where everybody is essentially either a slave or a small agricultural worker, you get fairly quickly into debt bondage, which we talked about as something that is still ongoing, where essentially you might own your land, but because agriculture has got such fickle backgrounds, cycles, you can have to borrow money in order to get seed or something like that, and at a certain point you are in debt bondage. And so having essentially a cancellation of debts is one way of alleviating a particular kind of slavery, but it's this debt slavery as opposed to chattel slavery, right? So it's not the stuff inside the dotted line that we were talking about before. So he has nowhere does he call for an ending of slavery in general. So that's not within the wheelhouse of anybody really in antiquity. Hardly anybody imagines that such a thing is even possible. When Plato is envisioning utopia, his republic, there are slaves, in the republic. When any of these theoretical, even mythological lands, they think of the lands of Caucania, it's called in the Middle Ages, Cuckoo Cloudland, and they make that in the it's an ancient Greek idea, but it's also in the Lego movie, right? So in Cuckoo Cloudland, there are slaves, in the Cuckoo Cloudland, because they just can't think of not having slaves, So the birds have slaves in Cuckoo Cloudland. But anyway, so Jesus is not calling for an end to slavery in general in the Bible. So in the canonical Gospels, Jesus heals slaves, but he does not free them, right? In any kind of physical, literal sense. Maybe he's freeing them in a Christian sense of some kind. Oh, but it gets worse, though. So what does Paul have to say? So writing in the 50s and 60s, Paul of Tarsus, Christianity's earliest surviving author, he also penned the largest number of texts that made it into the canonical New Testament. So while Paul, at his best, promoted a community where there is, quote, neither slave nor free person because you are all one in Christ Jesus, there's no longer Gentile or Greek, male or female, we're all one. And anyway, especially here in this society of Rome, it was impossible to think of this, neither slave nor free. Nevertheless, he accepted the reality that many members of the Christian community were legally slaves owned by other Christians. And that's something that he talks about a bunch of different places in his letters. So one of the occasions, the smallest book in the New Testament is a letter to Philemon. And Paul writes to a Christian named Philemon who owns this fugitive slave named Onesimus. And so Onesimus has actually run away from his master Philemon and has been working with Paul as kind of a missionary companion, sort of is probably like a freedman kind of servant relationship with Paul, although not actually technically a freedman because he's a fugitive slave. So Paul writes this letter where he is very circumspectly hinting to Philemon, hey, you really ought to free this guy who's so helpful to me, because wouldn't that be really a boon to everybody, and shouldn't we be freeing our fellow Christians and all these kind of things? And I'm kind of a big deal. I'm Paul, and I could order you to do this, but I'm not. But I mean, wouldn't you want to do it? And then wouldn't it also be nice if we'd wrap this whole thing up in a bow if once you free him, you send him back to me so that he can continue to help me out here? And that's kind of what that letter has. So whereas that letter exists, Paul also counsels Christian masters to treat your slaves fairly and justly, but not that you have to free them or anything like that. He nevertheless repeatedly instructed, there's multiple occasions, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with the sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. So there's lots of these slaves obey your masters lines, which Christian slave owners throughout history have been able to use to justify maintaining, the institution of slavery. Okay, so let's just switching over to pre-Islamic Arabia. Again, like everywhere else, so pre-Islamic Arabia is now the late antiquity, the early Middle Ages. Also, like all the rest of the ancient and medieval worlds, slavery is part of the society, right? So like Jesus, Muhammad lived in this slave-owning society and he interacts with slaves. There's all kinds of different anecdotal examples through both in Quran and also the other traditions about Muhammad. One of the examples is this guy Zaid, who as a young man was captured by raiders. And this is one of the ways that everybody's enslaved. It's not just if your city goes to war and you get captured as part of a giant soldiering group. If you get on a boat and go on a trip, pirates will come and attack your boat, and everybody on the boat is now a slave, on your boat. Likewise, if you were ever traveling in antiquity, it's just amazingly dangerous to go on a road or anything. Bandits capture you, and now you're a slave. And this certainly happened to Zaid. And so he gets taken to Mecca, and somebody buys him, gives it as a gift to this woman, Khadija, who, when she marries Muhammad, and as a gift on their wedding, as a wedding gift, she gives Zaid to Muhammad, and he ultimately then frees Zaid and adopts him as a son in a ceremony. So even though he's actually older than Muhammad, he adopts him. I think he's 10 years older. I was reading. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, so it's an example though of doing a good act. In other words, not Muhammad banishing or abolishing slavery, but showing by example manumission, right? That it's a good deed to free slaves that you have.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there is a surah in the Quran, Surah Al-Balad, which is the city that actually says that which is a reference to the steep pass of righteousness or steep or of goodness. And yeah, there we go. You beat me to it.
Yeah, we can.
No, this isn't the one.
Oh, that's the wrong one.
No, this is not the one.
Okay, I got the wrong one. Okay, you can tell me the one.
Yeah, so Surah Al-Balad, and it says and it says word for word, it's freeing of the slave is included in the things that you were supposed to do on this path of righteousness.
No,
and it's like a steeper.
The one I just have. We'll get to
Is
it.
it the one? Sorry,
Yeah.
my contact.
I'll read it. It's okay. We'll get to it. Yeah, exactly. No, there's a bunch of passages. So we'll get to those. So the Quran, slavery and the Quran then. So just as the ancient Greek philosophers, the Torah, Jesus, or the Christians took slavery as a given, the Quran likewise regulates rather than abolishes the practice. However, the Quran, like Paul, urges masters to be kind to their slaves and actually recommends their liberation by purchase or manumission. The freeing of slaves is recommended both if you want to do expiation of your own sins, and so there's multiple surahs that are like that, or simply just it's a good thing to do. And there's multiple actually surahs that do that. This is another example. Bilal here, who is an Ethiopian slave who is emancipated on the instructions from Muhammad, and then ultimately becomes one of the first people that do what's it called, muezzin. Yeah. So, okay, so here's a couple of the verses.
Yeah, this is the one, you're right.
Okay. And what will make you comprehend what the uphill road is? So there's two paths. There's one that's the road less taken, and there's one that's the wide road, that's the bad road, right? Or the wrong way. So what's the uphill road? It is setting free of a slave. So if you're doing all of these benevolent things, and the first one on the list here is setting free a slave, giving food, giving the giving of food in a day of hunger to an orphan, having relationship, or to the poor man lying in the dust, then he is of those who believe and charge one another to show patience and charge one another to show compassion. These are the people of the right hand, and as for those who disbelieve in our communications, they are the people of the left hand. Of them is fire closed over. So there's good things you can do, and the first one on the list that comes to mind is free slaves, right? Okay, and then this is the one that I went too far, and okay, this is a different one. So also, though, so we have been talking about this idea of chattel slavery, where we are dehumanizing the people who are enslaved and not considering them to be people, but the Quran is accepting that people are slaves, but they are still people who have beliefs and also should be treated with kindness, right? So let those who do not find the means to marry keep chaste until Allah makes them free from want out of His grace. And as for those who ask for a writing from among those whom your right hands possess, give them the writing if you know any good in them, and give them of the wealth of Allah, which He has given you. And do not compel your slave girls to prostitution when they desire to keep chaste, in order to seek the frail good of this world's life. And whoever compels them, then surely after their compulsion, Allah is forgiving and merciful. So it's a given in slavery. We should just mention all the way backwards and forwards. It's a given that when you have slave girls, and indeed when you have slave boys, they're used for sexual purposes. But what the Quran here is arguing is, if they don't want to, then don't. And we're saying don't do that. But if you do, then God's going to forgive. That's not their fault. So God is quite merciful to them, right? Okay. So, kind of going forward. So we now have not much time, and we're going to try to race forward to now, to the present, as we kind of set those kind of groundwork. So when we read in Torah, when we read in Leviticus and in Exodus, the Torah held out consideration for especially male Israelite slaves, but to some extent for the female, the daughters, not really. Anyway, so in other words, in terms of when we're looking at slavery, there's a lot of idea that people don't like to enslave your own group. So enslave the Israelites, enslave the Gentiles. Likewise, the Greeks at different times didn't like, at least foreigners to own Greek slaves, although at a certain point when the Romans owned it did have a bunch of Greek slaves. Likewise, medieval Muslims, Christians, and Jews attempted to avoid having slaves of their own religion, or were counseled against it, or in a lot of cases there were rules and laws against it. And so there were plenty of, in the West, church councils that forbid owning Christians as slaves, but that didn't forbid you from owning people who aren't Christians as slaves. Likewise, Muslims had the same, owning Muslim slaves, but you could have Christian slaves, Jewish slaves, but especially then everybody also could all have pagan slaves, right? So you could have what they would consider at the time heathens or pagans. So anybody you could capture who isn't already a Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew, right? So in that same way that, for example, kind of famously, that prohibition on usury, so Christians can't charge interest on loans to other Christians according to canon law that was actually obeyed a little bit to some extent in the Middle Ages, which is why Jews, although Jews also can't charge interest on loan to other Jews, according to, the rabbinic interpretation of the Levitical law and everything like that. What they could do was loan to each other, right? And so because Jews represented a very small percentage of
Video is sponsored by our first ever sponsor, Don't Hide the Plug. Don't Hide the Plug is an apparel company co-founded by two brothers from Flatbush, Tafari and Rossi Harper. Now these two black brothers have created an amazing, inspiring, high-quality brand. Now you see on Infominds, a lot of our content is New York based. We love New York, so it's only fitting that we partner up with a New York based brand, Don't Hide the Plug. Now they got some fire fitted hats, hoodies, t-shirts, and I'm feeling the old New York design with the bridge logo. They got the clout joints, the dad hats, and you can also have them delivered to you in the resealable merch by the pound bags too. Now mind you, they might be New York based, but their apparel is for everyone, whether you're from New York, Miami, Texas, Chicago. It's a grassroots movement. Get in tune. And they offer free shipping on all domestic orders of $75 or more. But if you enter the exclusive Infominds promo code, you'll get an additional 10% off at checkout. You already know I ordered my package. My package is on its way. So I'll be wearing and showcasing the Don't Hide the Plug apparel in my next live. Go out and support these brothers. Check out their website. I put the link in the description box. Don't Hide the Plug.